GB News is Britain's election channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Is a debate on gender really a far-right issue?
Far right. I'm so bored of that phrase, you know what I mean? Like, anyone who talks about... anyone who acknowledges that there are two sexes is suddenly far right, because that's what Hitler and Mussolini were all about. This question from Shirley is, of course, about Labour. They've been accused of being undemocratic because they pressured a pub into cancelling a debate, and this debate features Kelly J. Keane, who's been on this show a couple of times, and she's a campaigner, and she was just on the panel, and then they got a letter saying that they couldn't do it because Kelly J. Keane apparently attracts far-right groups. Now, they've tried this trick before, but because some awful, ghastly neo-Nazi types turned up near to an event that she was holding in Australia, they kind of tried to blame that on her and suggest that the two were the same thing. They weren't. That was an opportunistic group turning up to... they're not... neo-Nazis aren't pro-feminist. They're not pro an event called Let Women Speak. That's just ridiculous.
New Zealand's TV blurred her touching her zip because they said that her touching her zip was a far-right dog whistle because she's making that symbol.
Yeah, but she wasn't making the symbol,
Wow.
she was just adjusting a zip.
Yeah,
and
also, this isn't a far-right symbol.
I mean, that was incredible because she obviously wasn't making that symbol anyway. She was just adjusting a top. But this New Zealand news channel blurred out the hand so that they could pretend that it was some horrible ghastly...
Yeah.
I mean, this is learning stuff, isn't it?
She's talked about having voted Labour in the past. She's so not far right.
But also,
I mean,
even if she were right-wing, which she
Yes.
isn't, why would they be banning a panel where there's a discussion about one of the most important issues of our day? What are Labour playing at here?
They're anti-democratic, aren't they? They're just kind of playing whack-a-mole with things they don't like. I think maybe I'll write to the pub and say I do want to see Kelly J. Keane there.
Yeah, but they won't listen to you
Well,
if you
no,
say
they
that,
won't,
will
they
they? Because
won't.
you've got the unfashionable opinion, Chris.
Well, and the unfashionable workplace.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Good morning. Welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Goodness me, it's been another busy week in Westminster, and we're going to have a very busy show to reflect that. As Labour lost Rochdale to George Galloway and Rishi Sunak gave a speech on the steps of Downing Street calling for an end to mob rule, it seems Lee Anderson is old news. With this week bringing yet more record immigration figures and amid an ongoing row over the threat from rising Islamic extremism, former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick will be joining me in the studio to give us his two pennies worth. I'll be speaking to Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. What does the re-emergence of a politician who boasted of making Bradford an Israel-free zone and has described Hamas terrorists as fighters mean for Labour and its Muslim voters? On Wednesday, of course, all eyes and ears will be on Jeremy Hunt's spring budget. I'm delighted to say that the Chancellor will be joining me later in the studio as I grill him on whether his economic measures can really turn around the country, not to mention the Tories' electoral hopes. Former Chancellor Lord Norman Lamont will also be joining me in the studio to give his reaction to his successor's proposals. And at the end of another busy week for Donald Trump with an appearance at the US-Mexico border, Jason Miller, his former chief spokesman and senior advisor, will be joining me live from Washington to share his thoughts on the 2024 presidential race. It's going to be a rollercoaster 90 minutes of punchy political chat, so don't go anywhere. As ever on a Sunday morning, we're going to kick off with the papers, and I'm delighted to be joined now by Sam Lister, political editor at the Daily Express. Sam, lovely to see you this morning. Lots to go at, actually, but let's go with Budget Bonanza, because all of the papers, obviously, are trying to predict what Jeremy Hunt's going to put in the budget. He does these interviews. He's done one with the Sunday Telegraph talking about going to war on Whitehall Waste. Fair enough. But don't you find it quite funny that he does these rounds and people say, what's in the budget then? And he goes, no, I'm sorry, I can't tell you.
And what's the point? Why do we go through this dance? chance twice a year now, isn't it? So very, very difficult for interviewers like you to try and get something out of him, but I'm sure you will succeed, Camilla.
We'll try our best.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're in this pre-budget period now. Everyone's looking to Wednesday. But we're really in kind of scrabbling around in the back of the sofa territory here.
Yes.
There clearly is no money.
Gone?
It's disappeared. It started out at 30 billion. We hear now it's down to around 12 billion. You've got to save around half of that just for rainy day purposes, which leaves you with only around 6 billion.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of money to play with. So he's looking clearly at measures to grab a bit of money here, grab a bit of money there.
It's not very sexy, this. It isn't going to win an election, Sam.
It's not. And it's the Sun branded today, the Tesco budget, every little helps.
Oh.
And so he's taken a bit potentially from people who have second homes and rent them out to people.
Yeah, that'll
a little bit
well
here, a little bit
second
there.
homes, won't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, maybe he'll try and tap up Angela Rayner on that front. I know there's a story about that in Mail on Sunday. But also this argument that actually he has to be prudent. It's difficult, isn't it? People are crying out for tax cuts. There's a sort of debate going on, at least among the commentariat, as to whether it should be 1 or 2p off income tax. He's then kind of rolled out this pledge to cut this Whitehall waste, although, hang on, we've heard that all before. He's saying that that's going to save so many billion, but don't people need to see what we call in the trade retail offerings?
Absolutely.
They have to be really clear about what they're getting.
It has to be very, very simple, and it has to have a real impact in people's pockets. There is no point at this point, a few months out from a general election, doing something tricksy, something clever, something, you know, we take a bit here, we take a bit there. It has to be very, very clear. What MPs are telling me is they need a very clear offer to voters. They need to be able to go out on the doorstep and sell something. And after the last few years of real hardship, following, to be fair, the COVID pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, the government coffers have really been stretched. People do understand that. But I think now patience has run thin. They want to see some real action that makes a big impact in their pockets. And that's what Tory MPs want to be able to sell on the doorstep. So he has to make something quite big, a big offer on Wednesday, but obviously the finances are very restrictive.
I mean, they can say on the doorstep, we've cut tax if he does come out with a tax cut on Wednesday, but at the same time I suppose people might think, well, you were the ones who put it up in the first place. You've broken your manifesto pledge. And of course he's got Rachel Reeves. I know Rachel Reeves has been in the right-wing press quite a lot. She did an interview with the Telegraph yesterday. She's in the Sun on Sunday today, so she's on manoeuvres, hoping to entice some disgruntled Tories over to the Labour camp, which is interesting. The other big story of the weekend, Sam, is of course the terror threat, and people are reacting and riffing off this speech that Rishi Sunak gave on Friday. Odd timing, that. What did you make of it?
It was very odd. It was very odd. We got notice very late in the day. Obviously, then that set hairs racing. Everyone's thinking, is this the Prime Minister about to announce a general election? They had to kind of then tell us all, actually, no, this is not going to be about a general election. It's about security. But to make a statement in Downing Street, it's quite an unusual thing to do. It usually is because you were announcing a general election, because you've won one, or because there's been a terror attack. I don't remember one just on a general kind of point of principle like this. Particularly not on a Friday night when it's too late to make the 6 o'clock news.
Did you, as a political editor of a national newspaper, have to say, hold the front page?
Absolutely, we had to rip up our front page. But unfortunately for the Chancellor, he was going to be on our front page, but he was bumped by the Prime Minister.
That was weird timing, wasn't it?
It was very strange timing.
He wants to do all of the budget stuff, and suddenly we're talking about extremism.
Yeah.
We now hear from the Mail on Sunday that the terror threat is the highest it's been since 9/11.
Yeah. I don't think that will come as a surprise to people, because obviously the impact of the Middle East unrest, the invasion, clearly is having huge ramifications, not just in the UK, but across the world, certainly in America. And obviously we've seen across the UK the demonstrations, the feeling of unrest, the feeling of tension. So I don't think anybody will be surprised by that. I think just on a kind of very kind of personal level, I think a lot of MPs do feel very, very much under threat personally across the House, actually. It's not just limited to one party, this. And they do feel very, very concerned. Obviously, we've seen Mike Freer announce that he is standing down because he's basically, he cannot cope anymore with the level of threat.
Word of those 3 female MPs having to have bodyguards, even though they're backbenchers now, which is disturbing. And also, I suppose, there is some chat, and I'll put this to Robert Jenrick in just a moment because he's going to come into the studio after you. You know, is it just a commentary that the government's running? Where are the solutions? It was a great speech. I thought he spoke brilliantly, and he reflected very much the sort of feelings of Middle England in a way. But at the same time, where are the actions? Where are the measures? Ban the marches then.
His big thing was, we will introduce a new framework, and actually that doesn't really feel very much to people at home.
A new framework doesn't sound like
doesn't feel like
effective
grabbing
action.
the bull by the horns, does it?
Talking about bulls, nice little segue. Red Bull and the Horners being Red Bullish. Now, I mentioned this, we normally talk about politics, but it is a really big story this weekend, and it's been covered in all of the papers. Jerry Spice, Jerry Horner, Jerry Halliwell, as she was once known, appears at the Bahrain Grand Prix after Mr Horner has been accused, obviously, of sending these texts. We haven't got the contents of the text for privacy and other legal reasons. But at the same time, I just thought we'd have a conversation woman to woman about what you feel about Jerry sort of being produced onto the world stage at the Formula One to look as if everything's fine. It was like a Tammy Wynette, stand by your man moment.
It was all a bit 90s sleaze, wasn't it? You know, the kind of the kind of Tory MP from the 90s wheeling out his wife to the gate of the garden.
Nothing to see here,
everything's fine. I mean, what goes on in a marriage, you know, who knows? But wheeling out the wife in this way is always a bit sticks in my craw, I have to say. You know, there she was in the white designer dress.
She only ever
holding
wears
his
white.
hand. Yeah.
Which is an interesting policy from a fashion perspective. But then again, if she hadn't have turned up at the Grand Prix with him, it would have looked really sus, wouldn't it? I mean, she's taken one for the Red Bull team, I would suggest.
Yeah, she's kind of damned if she does, damned if she doesn't. But I feel like in this day and age, do women really have to be wheeled out in this way? I think it's a bit sad, really.
I know. I think the public sympathy will be on Jerry's side very much.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to finish with this because I know GB viewers and listeners will be very familiar with that iconic theme tune of Bergerac. What's happening in the news with Bergerac, Sam?
It's coming back.
Yay!
Great
I love
news.
Bergerac.
Sunday night viewing. Everyone loved Bergerac. I mean, a bit of glamour, lovely cars, crimes.
With Jim Nettles or somebody else?
I think it's going to be somebody else, but apparently big names are promised on this.
Ooh, which big names do we think?
Well, we don't know.
James Norton.
Oh, it could be.
I'm just guessing now.
In a bomber jacket and a neat type. Yeah, great. Sounds lovely.
So back to Jersey with crime being top of the agenda, top of the TV agenda. Sam, always lovely to have you in studio.
Pleasure.
Thank you for taking us through what's been going on this morning. Now, the People's Panel, which we know and love, is in Birmingham. And don't forget, Birmingham is in trouble because the council, the Labour-run council, has just announced it's going bankrupt. So I'm very intrigued to speak to Jack Carsons, who's there in Birmingham with the People's Panel this morning to find out what the main topic of conversation is. And it's not a no-go zone, is it? I know Paul Scully described Birmingham or parts of Birmingham like that in the week. But how are the good folk there, Jack?
Well, it's certainly been a very friendly welcome this morning here, Camilla, at the Cherry Reds Cafe, right in the city centre of Birmingham. But, of course, as you were mentioning, a really big week, not, of course, just for the country with the budget, but also the council here in Birmingham are going to vote on their new budget, of course, with all these hundreds of millions of pounds worth of cuts coming because of that bankruptcy. We've got our People's Panel here this morning with Sabrina Dennis, Steve Hardiman and Andrew Goodacre with us this morning. Sabrina, we're going to come to you first. You run a youth charity here in the city, of course. We've also got Bridget Phillipson on the panel on the show today. What kind of questions have you got today?
I'm interested to know what they're thinking about investment for our young people in the future. I mean, we've looked at everything and there's cuts everywhere, cuts to school budgets, cuts to youth services, cuts to charity work, cuts to everything. There's no safe spaces for young people. I want to know what they are planning to do with our young people because there is nothing for them.
Okay, and Steve, you run a manufacturing business here in the West Midlands. Budget this week. What could Jeremy Hunt, or what questions have you got?
Well, I'd like to know what he's going to do for SMEs in the budget. I've never known such a hostile business environment as the one we're living in at the moment. And basically, I'm hoping that he's going to give us some sort of relief from the terrible troubles that we've had. But I doubt whether we're going to get that.
Okay, and Andrew, you're part of the British Independent Retailers Association. So, what kind of questions have you got for the Chancellor and for Labour on today about the coming week in the budget?
Well, like Steve's business is an SME, our members, independent retailers, are SMEs. So we certainly want to see something in the budget that helps independent retailers. The high streets have struggled in the cost of living crisis. We need something that's going to give us growth, economic certainty, and boost consumer spending. Wider than that, we need to know what's the plan for local communities who need investment, who need alternative ways of thinking, not just for our generation, but for younger generations as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for all of the panel for those questions. Some big topics for you to discuss today, Camilla.
Always big topics to discuss. Thank you for that, Jack, and the People's panellists. Now, don't move a muscle, because in just a few minutes I'm going to be joined by former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, who'll be here in the studio to address what we should be doing about the threat from Islamic extremism. Is the government doing enough? We'll also, of course, be speaking to Bridget Phillipson, and I'll be speaking to Norman Lamont and the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight, every night from 11 p.m.
Welcome back to Headliners, and Paul, we're going to get straight into Monday's mail for some good old-fashioned, traditional male breastfeeding.
Yeah. To answer the question, what is the latest woke hell, Josh? Row as hospitals say hormone-filled milk from trans women who were born male is just as good for a baby as the real thing. It's possible for men, if they pump themselves full of estrogen, to grow larger breast tissue, and they often do. If
or you just eat lots of burgers.
Exhibit A. And once you've done that, it is actually then possible to express or lactate
a liquid.
Okay. If to that liquid you then add another load of pills, medication, chemicals, whatever, that lactation juice can be fed to a baby.
We don't really... This is not for the sake of the baby. The baby has no benefits from this whatsoever. The studies are very weak on it. It's a bit worrying because, you know, when hospitals started indulging in homeopathy and having, the NHS had homeopathic hospitals, that was worrying because they're supposed to be a trusted authority. And before saying something like this, there should be an awful lot of study done.
I want to shame this hospital. This is
whether it's necessary.
University Hospital Sussex NHS Foundation Trust. That's who it is. And they have written one of the stupidest sentences I have read aloud in the 2 years that I've been privileged to do this show. It says, the term human milk is meant to be neutral and not gender biased.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
That's incredible.
Yep. Oh, my God, we're laughing at you.
I mean, and as someone says here, babies are not props. And that's the scary thing. And when we're not focusing primarily on the health of a baby.
No, but the feeling of a person doing it rather than... It's a bit of an odd way to go, isn't it? So...
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News. You're watching the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm delighted to be joined now by former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, the Conservative MP for Newark. Nice to see you, Robert.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming back into the studio. You've written a really interesting op-ed, an opinion piece in the Mail on Sunday, which is headlined, "Why does the left consider it Islamophobic to want to expel the cancer of extremism from Britain?" It's a very compelling piece where you talk about what the government should be doing. Now, I suppose my first question is, what's your reaction to what Rishi Sunak said on the steps of Downing Street on Friday night? It was punchy rhetoric, but I thought it was conspicuous by its absence of actual measures to stop what's going on.
Well, I thought it was a good start. It's important to recognise the problem.
if you're going to start to fix it. But you're absolutely right that at this late stage, all that matters are solutions. And the first one, to me, is that you cannot resolve this problem, build a more united country, which is what the Prime Minister was calling for, a more cohesive country built around British values, unless you end this era of mass migration. We've been living in a time where up to 1 million people have arrived in our country every year, and it's impossible to successfully integrate so many people. The level of migration that we've experienced as a country over the last 30 years has been unprecedented, and that needs to change.
So are you saying that we've been importing Islamic extremists? I mean, at the same time, many of the people that may be that vocal minority calling for jihad on the streets of London could be born here.
Absolutely, but I think it's an important part of the solution to say that you can't integrate people at this pace, and we have to row back on that now, and we have to move to a system where immigration is controlled and orderly, and the numbers are just very significantly fewer. But that's not the only part of the solution.
But do we move back to tens of thousands?
I think we need to. I was elected on a manifesto pledge of tens of thousands. If you look at all of the polling of the public, that is around the level that they would expect. In fact, many people would like it to be less than that. And for a range of reasons, not just these important social questions, economically, in terms of the pressure on housing and public services, we've got to get it down to that level.
We're told mass migration is a great thing for the economy because more people are paying tax. You know, this is something I'll put to the Chancellor, this idea that migration has overwhelmingly good economic benefits. I mean, I think that's been disproven by the fact that there's a shortage of housing and our public services are seeming to be completely crippled. But at the same time, the Treasury seems to be addicted to migration.
Well, I think there's mounting evidence to support what you've just said. For the past 7 quarters, the British economy has shrunk by GDP per capita.
Yes.
And I think that is all that should matter to our government and to politicians. I don't care about the size of the pie. Overall, I care about the wealth and prosperity of each and every one of our fellow citizens.
Why won't government ministers put a cap on migration? I mean, I've had so many people in that seat and I've asked them that question and they just resist it, even though David Cameron was really clear when he gave his tens of thousand pledge.
Well, I think we should move to that kind of system. I think we now need to move to something that's radically different. I was pleased at the end of last year I brokered the biggest reduction in migration that we've seen for a very long time, which will lead to 300,000 fewer people coming in each year. But that's not enough. We need to go much further than that. And in the piece I've written today in the Mail on Sunday, I'm drawing the connection between that and the fraying social fabric that we're seeing as a country. And that, I think, is a very important element of this.
Aren't you risking being accused of Islamophobia with some of these interventions? We've heard from others, including Nick Timothy, who was Theresa May's former advisor. He's now a candidate, a Tory candidate, I think, in Suffolk. He's saying that actually the government needs to go much, much further. Not only should they ban the marches, they should also stop the funding of mosques and Islamic centres. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with much of what Nick has said. We need a completely different approach to this. And you're right to say that many people are too afraid to intervene in this debate because either they want to pretend this doesn't exist or they know it does, but they're afraid of being labelled as an Islamophobe. And that is not a healthy way for us to proceed.
Is Lee Anderson an Islamophobe?
No, I don't think he is.
Should he have the whip restored, do you think? I mean, has he said anything wrong? He said nothing worse than what David Cameron said about Sadiq Khan in 2016. He said the leader of the Labour Party is saying it's disgraceful, telling him, he was referring to somebody, that the honourable member for Tooting has appeared on a platform with an extremist 9 times, Cameron said at the time. This man supports the Islamic State, he pointed out. We then had Zach Goldsmith saying that Sadiq Khan was a politician who had, quotes, given platforms, oxygen and even cover over and over again to those who seek to do our police and capital harm. So actually, Lee Anderson said nothing worse than the Foreign Secretary and Zach Goldsmith, a former minister.
Well, Lee is not an Islamophobe. He made comments which were mistaken. He's clarified those now. And I think we need to move on, because the problem with what happened over the last week is that it's closed down the debate on the really important issue, which is that we have a problem in this country with Islamist extremism, and we need a proper national conversation about that and a strategy to tackle it. All that matters now are the solutions, and they are reducing mass migration, ending this era of careless, naive mass migration, having a new strategy taking the Prevent programme forward with the reforms that Suella Braverman
Tell me
set
about
forward.
Prevent. Is Prevent fit for purpose currently? I mean, I know William Shawcross...
It's not working at the moment.
...expressed concern about
That's right. So William Shawcross did a very important review, which is being implemented, but it needs to be implemented very quickly. And at the heart of the problem that he identified is that it has been a victim of political correctness. The overwhelming majority of the people who we should be concerned about today are Islamist extremists. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about the far right. The far right is just as divisive and destructive, but it is a smaller threat today than Islamist extremism. Therefore, the majority of our effort and focus should be on Islamist extremism, and that is not the way that the Prevent programme is working today. So we need to refocus it on the real threat to our country and not be afraid to do that out of misplaced political correctness.
Do you think that there's a problem that not enough moderate Muslims are calling out the extremists in their midst?
Well, Islamist extremism is not Islam, and it's not the law-abiding British Muslim population. We need to make that clear. And it's wrong when people label those of us who are very concerned about Islamist extremism as anti-Muslim. I care just as much about anti-Muslim hatred and prejudice in this country as I do about anti-Semitism, for example. Not a competition between the two. We do need to see, I think, more Muslim voices, moderate Muslim voices, and there are many people who are making this point, coming out and leading this national conversation about how we can get rid of, expel this cancer of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim hatred from the country once and for all.
We see on the front of the Mail on Sunday that it's now considered that with the threat level to people living in Britain is the highest it has been since 9/11. Do you think there's a correlation between how the police have handled the marches and this fear of extremism escalating even further? Do you think the police are perhaps treating the marches almost with kid gloves because they don't want it to escalate into, God forbid, a terror attack at some point?
Well, I want to see, as in fact the Prime Minister said last week, more active policing. We don't want to just manage these protests, we want to police these protests. And many people, for example British Jews, have found the police to be too passive. And I found this and have spoken out about this many times. For example, when you had a hate preacher near Oxford Street calling for jihad, and the police stood by, allowed that individual to continue. That's completely unacceptable.
I mean, it was wrong for the police to say, oh, jihad has got many different meanings. It's wrong as well, surely.
Well, that was both factually wrong. It was a misreading of jihad, but it was also completely unacceptable. We need to have a much stronger policing presence on the streets of London and elsewhere.
What should have happened to the people who projected from the river to the sea onto Big Ben?
They should have been arrested immediately. We shouldn't just sit back and allow that to happen. I thought that was a gross act which really symbolised where we'd got to as a country, where a genocidal chant could be projected onto our parliament, whilst Parliament itself was debating some of these issues. I think that is an example of where the British public are crying out for much stronger policing. And I think there's a fear that there is cowardice here. People are not willing to step up and take the action that's necessary.
It's mixed messaging, isn't it, from the Prime Minister? Because on one hand, he decides that Suella Braverman must go, the Home Secretary, the former Home Secretary who worked closely with at the Home Office, because she's pointing out that the police are picking favourites and that they're taking sides, and she has repeatedly warned against Islamic extremism and said about the dangers. He then gives a speech in Downing Street basically saying exactly what Suella's been saying. Has this now vindicated Braverman, do you think?
I think many of the arguments that Suella was making 4 or 5 months ago have been proven to be absolutely right. Is there a genuine concern that there is two-tier policing in this country? Yes, I think that she was right to say that that's a concern. Would some of these incidents be policed differently? Were they far-right versus the Islamic extremist element that we're seeing? I think there's a strong case to say that there is. But what matters now, I think, is less around the personalities or the sentiments. I'm pleased to see that the Prime Minister has adopted much of the rhetoric that Suella and I have been saying for several months. What matters are solutions and answers to this question. That's what the public's crying out for now.
Really briefly, because we're running out of time, Rochdale, George Galloway, I mean, has that now become a no-go area for Jews, do you think?
No, I don't think so, and I certainly hope not. I think it's very concerning that George Galloway was elected. The campaign was a nasty and sectarian campaign. I don't like to see someone standing for office in our country putting the flag of another country on their literature. But
wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg and this is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg's State of the Nation, Monday to Thursday from 8 p.m.
You're now in exile. I imagine it wouldn't be safe for you to go back to Russia. Can I ask you if you feel safe personally, and what do you think can be done to remove Putin, or is he going to be there for as long as he wants?
I think that is, of course, fundamental question. It is there should be pressure inside Russia and outside. Inside Russia right now, it's impossible because Putin put all leaders in jail and some of us just abroad. You know, just two were already killed. Mr. Nemtsov, Boris Nemtsov, my friend, my collaborator on my party, was killed on the walls on Kremlin. Alexei Navalny was killed in jail and in the camp. And that is, the people live in fear to identify themselves as protesters, to identify themselves as against Putin's regime, etc. That's why today there is no chance for opposition to rise inside Russia. But outside, of course, this war against Ukraine, that is the fundamental issue for all foreign leaders. And in fact, just support of Ukraine and not to let Putin to destroy Ukraine, to defeat Ukraine. That is an important issue because just Ukraine, that's not just in Ukraine, war in Ukraine. Ukraine just fighting for their territorial integrity, but fighting for the whole European countries because after Ukraine, other countries could appear, other subject of aggression could be, and Putin easily could try to test Article 5 of NATO Charter. It could be one of the small countries of Baltic states.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. So much more to come in the next hour. We've got Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. Can his budget turn around the fortunes of the country as well as the Tories? And I'll be speaking to Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson in just a minute for her take on whether Labour needs to start worrying about the threat of independent candidates taking on safe seats at the next general election. But first, here's the morning's headlines with Sam Francis.
Camilla, thank you very much. It's just gone 10 o'clock and we start with our top story of the day, that thousands of people have taken to the streets in pro-Palestine protests across Britain this weekend after the Prime Minister's warning earlier this week of extremist threats. Campaigners also targeted around 50 Barclays bank branches, which they accuse of having financial ties with suppliers of weapons. Police ordered the protesters to move on and they cited the Section 14 of the Public Order Act. It comes after Rishi Sunak's speech in Downing Street on Friday, when he warned that Islamist extremists and far-right groups are, he says, spreading poison in British democracy. The government is reportedly considering blocking hate preachers from entering Britain, with more people added to warning lists. Reports suggest that current powers could be used to increase the number of people who are prevented from entering the country if they're deemed to be non-conducive to public good. That could include those who preach racism, intimidation or incite violence. Currently, the rules are typically used to ban people who are known to pose a security threat. The Chancellor has suggested that changes to tax could come into force with reforms targeting holiday lets, levies on vaping, changes to non-dom statuses, all under consideration. Ahead of Wednesday's announcement, the Treasury has also revealed an £800 million tech package to boost productivity in the NHS and police with new AI and drones. Labour says the suggested reforms, though, are spin without substance. Forecasts also appear to show that Jeremy Hunt has little to no headroom for tax cuts, which will limit the prospect of any pre-election giveaways. Labour will ensure that compulsory training on violence against women and girls is given to all police officers in the UK. That's following the inquiry into Sarah Everard's killer, Wayne Couzens. Labour's also vowed to revamp police vetting procedures to stop those with a history of domestic abuse or sexual offences from joining any police force. A published report this week found that Wayne Couzens should never have been given a job as a police officer, and the chances to stop the sexual predator were repeatedly ignored and missed. Today marks 3 years since he killed Sarah Everard, who was 33 at the time, after tricking her into thinking she was being arrested. He has since been sentenced to life in prison and will never be released. And finally, rail passengers in England and Wales face a new 5% price hike from today. That's despite train cancellations being among the worst in the last 10 years. Campaigners argue the public are being unfairly punished by the increase. It comes after thousands of services were cancelled in the past year, one of the worst performances in the rail industry's history. Travel expert Simon Calder told GB News this morning what it will mean for passengers.
To put it into context, there's one particular journey from Didcot Parkway in Oxfordshire to Swindon. It only takes 14 minutes. It's about 24 miles, and that is going to be going up to over £30 for less than a quarter of an hour of rail travel. And people are understandably cheesed off. I mean, it's as though your rail ticket is now actually a kind of on-the-spot fine.
Those are the headlines. I'll be back at 11 for more of the top stories. In the meantime, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the code on your screen, or of course go to our website, gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Sam. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Still lots more to come. In just a minute, we'll be joined by the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, where I'll try to get to the heart of what will be in his spring budget announcement next Wednesday. Will this start to bring some much-needed good news for Sunak's cabinet? I'll be asking the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, whether Angela Rayner's taxes need to have a closer examination. I'll also be joined by the former Chancellor, Lord Norman Lamont, for an in-depth pre-spring budget analysis following my interview with his successor, Jeremy Hunt. And Jason Miller, the former chief spokesman and senior advisor to Trump, will be live from Washington with the latest verdict on how the Donald is faring and whether he can fend off those court cases ahead of the presidential elections. Well, I'm hoping now to be joined by Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, the MP for Horton and Sunderland South. Miss Phillipson, I know it's quite loud there. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I wanted to ask you whether you agreed with the Prime Minister when he said that we've got an extreme problem with Islamic fundamentalism in Britain today.
Hello, good morning. I am slightly struggling to hear you, but I'll do my very best with your questions. I do think we need to make sure that extremism is being tackled in whatever form or shape that takes. And I agree with the Prime Minister that it is essential as a country that we make sure that violence, that hatred is tackled.
Are you worried particularly about Islamic extremism in schools? I mean, we note that that teacher in Batley is still in hiding after 3 years.
Of course, that is completely unacceptable, and I'm worried about extremism right across the board. It takes different shapes and different forms, and sadly it has led us to the position where there has been unacceptable violence and intimidation across our society.
How would Labour change things, Miss Phillipson? I've heard from Robert Jenrick in the studio today saying that he thinks mass migration is a problem and that we need to put a cap on immigration. Do you agree with him?
Well, we do. Of course, we need a migration system that responds to the needs of the economy and has done so in a balanced way. But I'm not convinced that that kind of rhetoric is going to aid the conversation that we have as a country about how we make sure we are tackling extremism, and connecting the two in that kind of way. I don't think is necessarily the right way to be doing things.
I mean, he's making the point that we accepted 745,000 people into the UK last year. That's a record high. And his point is it's very difficult to police who's coming in when the numbers are that high.
Well, he was the immigration minister, so I'm not quite sure what he's been doing with his time. If he now thinks there's a problem, he had some say in this matter, and you know, I don't quite know why he now thinks it's somehow all to do with someone else. I mean, it is essential that we have strong borders. Of course it is. And I want to see more action on the criminal smuggling gangs. I want to make sure that we're stopping people making that perilous journey, and that we clamp down on those gangs, that we see tougher action. And that's why Labour would make sure that we've got that cross-border policing unit so that we are taking action against it.
Would Labour make sure that immigration is lower under Keir Starmer?
Well, I would expect immigration to fall. It's partly been at a record high because of the Ukraine crisis, and also the fact that we have quite rightly been taking in people from Hong Kong, for example. But I would expect migration to fall, yes.
Should Labour take responsibility for the re-emergence of George Galloway in Rochdale? I mean, let's be honest, it was a safe Labour seat. So if it hadn't have been for your candidate's anti-Semitic remarks causing him to be suspended, Labour would have won that seat and Galloway wouldn't be back in Parliament.
I deeply regret what has taken place in Rochdale, and I'm very sorry that we've ended up in this situation because Labour had to pull our candidate because of those unacceptable comments. But sadly, it was necessary, and Keir Starmer took decisive action to make sure that he was clear that the Labour Party had changed. That did mean that we effectively had to pull support from our candidate, didn't field a candidate in that by-election. But what we will make sure is that we will select a really strong candidate for the general election, which isn't too far away, and that candidate is someone who can seek to unite the community once more rather than stoke division, which I think is sadly what we're likely to see in the months to come there.
Although we learned today that another Labour candidate, Mohammed Iqbal, is being investigated because of his support to Azhar Ali. So how many more Labour candidates are having to be investigated for potentially anti-Semitic views?
You'll understand that we have a process in place where complaints are made and there is a full investigation, and politicians don't involve ourselves in individual investigations or individual cases. But it is absolutely right that where concerns are raised, they are investigated. We've got strong processes in place. That is why we ended up in a situation where we pulled support for our candidate in Rochdale because of the unacceptable nature of those comments. So it does often come at a price, but it is the right thing to do because we want to make sure that every Labour candidate who stands for elected office and going into that general election this year is of a high calibre and where we can be confident in their ability.
Does Angela Rayner face questions over this council house, Farrago? 2 houses. We now find out that the house that she may or may not have been living in some years ago has had council money spent on it to lower a front curb. There are questions to answer here. I mean, the thing is Miss Rayner is the first to start accusing Tories of not having their tax affairs in order. She should answer questions in the House about this, shouldn't she, Miss Phillipson?
My understanding is that where it comes to tax, Angela Rayner has sought advice and is clear that she has done nothing wrong. I think on some of the wider points that you're then making there, I'll be honest, I find some of that quite uncomfortable because it does relate to Angela Rayner's personal circumstances and her family. And I do think we need to be slightly careful around some of that because of this does relate to at least one of her children, is my understanding.
I know, but she's more than happy to throw stones at others when it comes to their own tax affairs. I appreciate tax is a personal matter, but at the same time, there are questions to be answered, aren't there, about whether she was living in this home, whether that was actually a second home, and whether she's paid enough capital gains tax. If she's got nothing to hide, then surely she answers the questions that are put to her.
Well, I believe she has, and she has sought advice on the tax implications and has concluded that she has followed the rules around all of that. But much, I think, of what you're describing is before Angela was a Member of Parliament. So I think there is a distinction there. But alongside that, where it relates to politicians' families and their family circumstance, and I think part of what you're talking about does fit into that category, then I do think we need to tread with just a little bit of care.
I know, but then Labour was quite critical of the Prime Minister's wife's tax affairs. So this is a bit hypocritical, isn't it? You can scrutinise the tax affairs of others, but not your own.
Well, I think part of what I'm talking about is also where it comes to children in this, and we do need to, I think, particularly exercise some care where it comes to children's privacy. But absolutely, I think where it comes to tax decisions that governments take where there are potential benefits in the way that we've seen, I think that is absolutely right, because the Prime Minister has himself personally gained from some of this.
But if Angela Rayner's personally gained and there are tax implications, then she needs to explain herself, doesn't she?
Well, as I say, she has answered questions on this and she sought advice and is confident that she's followed the rules.
You've described the Tories' childcare pledge as being in tatters. What would Labour do differently, Ms Phillipson?
It is in tatters. It was a year ago that the Chancellor promised places for parents, new entitlements, and as those deadlines approach, parents are increasingly finding those options just aren't there, because what we got from the Chancellor at the last budget was a pledge with no plan to make it happen. I'm determined that Labour will be different, that we will make sure we put this absolutely, that we put the support in place that families need, but we make sure we've got a plan to make it happen. That's why I've asked Sir David Bell, who was formerly the Chief Inspector of Ofsted, to lead Labour's early years review to help us develop that work and how we make sure we've got the places, how we've got the really high quality provision that families need. But as a first step, I've set out Labour's plan for making sure that we've got universal free breakfast clubs in every primary school in our country. That would make a major difference to people right across our country, and I think would be, gives children a great start to their day, but also has really strong evidence behind it in terms of better academic outcomes.
Bridget Phillipson, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
That's the Shadow Education Minister there speaking to me. Now, you won't want to miss what's still to come on today's show. In just a minute, I'm going to be speaking to the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, to see what he has in store for us in his spring budget on Wednesday. Don't go anywhere.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Nana Queer, weekends from 3 p.m.
Sadiq Khan, 6.3 million on a virtue signal, loading lines. Why is he spending the people's money in this way? And why is nobody saying anything? I want to hear from Suzanne Hall, the potential Conservative candidate, or Howard Cox, the potential Reform candidate who could potentially take this off Sadiq Khan. Why are they not speaking? This is ridiculous.
Well, it was sprung on everybody. Did you know about that?
I didn't know about it.
Nobody knows. So they're spending this money. They're spending £6.3 million, and no one knew about it. Where's the press? Where are the public consultations? No one knew. I think it's a good idea to rename the train lines, because all these train lines are so, there are like 4 of them, 6 of them, whatever, and they're all going all these different directions, and you tell someone to come, and you don't even know the name.
Yeah, but 6.3 million. Listen, if you want to give me 6.3 million to come up with some virtue signalling lines, I'd like to know which advertising agency he employed to do this, how long it took him, and why he's even done it in the first place. Why has he done this?
He has done this with the virtue signalling because he's part of T-World. He's Rishi Sunak. It's this whole concept is every inclusiveness. There is no country. Nobody's English. Our own history is bad. Not my history, but whatever. The English history is bad. And it's a denial of history. It's Orwellian or something. Yeah. Not that I know about.
I think it's an absolute absurdity that Sadiq Khan should be doing that. He's got a knife crime epidemic, a crime epidemic, people stealing watches off people walking down the street. Yes. You've got the burglary at an all-time high. London, a lot of people are put off by it. And this is what he spent £6.3 million on.
This could have been a bit
to speak as to why.
He doesn't need to speak. People need to speak out and say, well, why didn't we know about this? But the idea, can I say something to you, Nana? The idea is right. It's like, for example, take the Northern Line. You know, there are 6 Northern Lines.
6 Northern Lines.
6 different Northern Lines, maybe more now, because one goes from Mill Hill East to Mill Hill.
This was the overground he was...
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Now, earlier on, I had the pleasure of sitting down with the Chancellor to find out what's going to be in Wednesday's budget and how he's going to emulate Nigel Lawson's economic boom. Joining me now in the studio is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt. Chancellor, lovely to see you this morning. Thank you so much for coming in. I think it's your first appearance with me on GB News, so it's great to have you.
The first one in the studio.
Indeed so, yes. We've done down-the-line interviews. Can we start, just before we get onto the budget, to talk about Rishi Sunak's speech on Friday outside Downing Street? He talked a lot about the current situation with extremism. Obviously, he was reacting to the election of George Galloway in Rochdale. I felt that it was a good commentary, but there weren't very many action points in there. Is the government all talk and no action on extremism? What measures are you going to introduce to try and stop this?
No, he was clear that there are things the government needs to do. What he was really saying is that we have a traditional British virtue of tolerance. And what we've seen in the last few months is a line being crossed with protests that are intimidatory, that have led to some people feeling it's not safe to go out of their homes when they're going on. That is not the British way. He said the government will legislate to ban intimidatory marches, give the police the powers they need to stop them.
Yes.
But he's also said that there's a responsibility on all of us. And he pointed out the vast majority of people on these protests want to protest peacefully.
Yes.
They too have a responsibility to call out extremism when it happens.
But weren't people watching that speech and thinking, it's great, you've identified the problems, but what are the solutions? I mean, people are saying, in fact, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, has said, you know, you've made your point with the marches now, just stop them. Why doesn't the government stop them? We had Suella Braverman in the studio a few weeks ago saying the police have got the powers, they're just not using them. So why not stop the marches now? Because unfortunately, they have been hijacked by a small minority.
Well, we have asked the police to use the powers they have. As I said, we've also said that we will legislate to give them additional powers. We've said that we will expel people who cross that line if they are foreign nationals, and we will prescribe organisations that promote that kind of behaviour, like Hizb ut-Tahrir. But we are also very clear, this is about our whole country. This is not just something for the government. This is about restoring that traditional British virtue of tolerance, that understanding that the way you get change in this country is through peaceful protest within the law. But if those protests are within the law, of course, we will always support people's right to do them.
I mean, you've been a politician for a long time. Do you feel more intimidated and threatened now than you have been in the past?
Well, I actually live in Downing Street now, so I hear those protests often at the weekend. Personally, I would never say that I'm worried, but I have had very disturbing emails, particularly from Jewish friends, who say that some of this behaviour makes them frightened to go out of their front door. And that is not the Britain that I want, or I think anyone wants, and that's why it's right to take action.
Let's talk about the economic Britain that you want. Obviously, the budget, there's a lot of pressure on you on Wednesday to deliver. Many people are saying this is last chance saloon for the Tories. Do you recognise that this budget could be make or break when it comes to the next general election?
Of course, budgets are very, very important moments. This is likely to be the last budget before the general election. But British people are very smart. They recognise gimmicks. They don't want any tricks. What they will get on Wednesday is a prudent and responsible plan for long-term growth.
I mean, do they want prudence, Mr Hunt? At the same time, they do recognise that the tax burden is the highest it's been in 70 years. They're desperate for some relief. They want to keep more of the money that they earn. We hear in the papers that there's a debate going on between a 1p or 2p income tax cut. Can you confirm here this morning that there will be an income tax cut?
You know, Camilla, how this works, and chancellors don't reveal the contents of their budgets, even on GB News, however amazing the interviewer is.
But are you confident there's fiscal headroom for a tax cut in theory?
Well, let me answer the questions you asked. So, first of all, prudence. There is nothing less conservative than funding tax cuts by increasing borrowing.
But there's nothing less conservative than having a tax rate in the highest region that it has been in peacetime. That's unconservative, isn't it?
Well, let me answer. This is a bit like that sort of Two Ronnies sketch where I'm going to answer the question before last. But I'll just say, first of all, that I do want to bring taxes down. Absolutely. They're too high. And why do I want to bring them down? Because I look around the world and the most dynamic, fastest growing economies in North America and Asia are generally countries where the tax burden is lower. So yes, I want to bring them down. Why have they gone up? Because we spent nearly £500 billion supporting families in the pandemic and in the cost of living crisis. That was the right thing to do. Because of that, unemployment is at historic lows, and I think we did the right thing there. It has to be paid for. Now we need to get back on a path to lower taxes. I will do that in a responsible way. I hope to show progress, but this is not something that is going to happen overnight. But
so you're really managing expectations here. That's the vibe I'm getting from you, because at the beginning of the year you were channeling your inner Nigel Lawson and you were pitch rolling tax cuts because I think you thought you had 30 billion of fiscal headroom. The OBR has turned around and said you've actually got 12.8 billion, but then some of your colleagues question the reliance on the OBR forecast when they often prove to be too gloomy and wrong. Why is the OBR now dictating what should be in your budget rather than just providing some advice on the sidelines? Are you kind of entrapped by what the OBR is telling you?
Well, it was a Conservative government that set up the OBR in 2010. And the reason that we set it up was because people worried that when Gordon Brown was doing his budgets under the previous Labour government, chancellors were cooking the books. They were giving forecasts that gave an unduly rosy picture of the situation. And people wanted to have confidence that what a chancellor said, the figures that a chancellor announced, have been independently verified.
But there's independent verification and then there's actually dictating what should be in your budget, isn't it?
Well, all the OBR does is tell the country independently whether I am meeting the fiscal rules that I myself have chosen.
But what if the OBR is wrong, as it has been historically many years over?
Well, in fairness to the OBR, they are, of course, they made mistakes in their forecasts, but they are more accurate than the forecast that the Treasury used to do when we didn't have an OBR, and they are broadly in line with other forecasters. But look, I don't say that, you know, there aren't things that you can improve in the systems that we have, but fundamentally what people at home want to know is that when you cut taxes, it's forever.
OK.
And that's why we want to go on this path to lower taxes. But we want to do so in a way that is credible, sustainable, and people know is responsible.
OK. You're talking as well about cutting Whitehall waste. I mean, GB News viewers and listeners could be forgiven for saying to themselves, what, again? I mean, how many times has the government announced that it's going to cut Whitehall waste? The trouble is that this Whitehall waste is built up on your watch. It's built up over the course of the last 14 years. So you're having to unravel things that you're responsible for.
No, I don't think that's fair, Camilla.
Well, Whitehall staffing has gone up since pre-pandemic, and indeed the cost of Whitehall has gone up. The cost of government spending is higher than it was.
Yes, but that is since the pandemic, and that's what I want to do. I want to bring the numbers of civil servants down to the level that they were before the pandemic. Between 2010 and 2019, we saw sustained increases in public sector productivity. Over that period, by the way, standards in our schools went up. Crime went down. We had more doctors and nurses in the NHS treating more people than ever before. The pandemic stopped that. And what I'm saying in the budget on Wednesday is I want to restart the process of public sector reform, because public sector productivity is 6% lower than pre-pandemic. And it is wrong to say that we should be putting more money into the public sector.
So you want fewer civil servants to be more productive?
Correct.
You want fewer people to do more?
I think we've got to stop always looking at the inputs and always saying that the way to get better public services is to spend more and actually ask if we could be more efficient. And one of the ways that I think we particular interest to GB News viewers is knife crime. Now, we've halved violent crime. We're very proud of the progress that's been made.
Okay.
But part of that is through these things called violence reduction units, which intervene with people who might be the kind of people who would commit a knife crime. They have prevented about 130,000 knife crimes and other crimes. So we're actually going to spend money to roll those out because we know that will save money down the line. That is the change in approach.
Are you going to be spending more money on defence?
Well, I have already spent more money on defence.
We've got Vladimir Putin is spending 7.5% of Russian GDP on defence. We're spending 2.2%. We need to spend more, don't we, with everything going on in the world?
Well, I do think going forward we will need to spend more money on defence, and we have said that as soon as it is possible to do so within our economic context, we'll increase that spending to 2.5% of GDP. But can I just say, you know, Rishi Sunak, when he was doing my job as Chancellor, gave the defence sector the biggest sustained increase in funding since the Cold War.
I know, but yet the numbers are low, aren't they? We've got the smallest amount of troops since the Napoleonic Wars, so there's concerns about defence. Very briefly, because I know you're on limited time, Mr. Hunt. Just on migration, there's been this theory, I think, that actually migration is inherently a good thing, that it's good for the economy, it's good to get more numbers in. But actually that's not quite true, is it? Because of the pressure on housing and indeed our public services. So should migration come down, and shouldn't you consider putting a cap on it as a Tory government?
I think migration in limited numbers can be beneficial. But what I think is wrong is this idea that you should get economic growth by allowing in more migrants.
Why does the Treasury keep on sort of being proponents of that theory then? The more people that come in, the higher the tax receipts. Why don't you put a stop to it? I mean, what was it, 745,000 last year, a record amount of immigrants coming into this country. Country can't cope with that many people.
Well, first of all, the Treasury is not a proponent of that. What we want to do is create a high-wage, high-skill economy that is not dependent on unlimited migration. Secondly, migration is too high, but it is because there were some very specific international factors.
But would there be a migration cap in the budget on Wednesday, perhaps?
Well, what is decided for the next Parliament will be a matter for the manifesto. But what we want to do, and what I'll be doing on Wednesday, is saying how do we move from an economy that has been dependent on migration for growth to a high-wage, high-skill economy that is not dependent on high levels of migration. And that is a profoundly different approach to the Labour Party. They have no strategy or no plan to control migration. We do. It's not been easy with the...
Although, may you be forced, if you have to hand over the reins of the Treasury to Rachel Reeves, to be leaving a note like Liam Bird did and say there's no money left?
I'm not planning to hand over any note to Rachel Reeves because I'm intending to win the next election. But what I would say is that look at the difficult decisions that I took a year ago as Chancellor to balance the books. When Labour had a financial crisis, did they take any difficult decisions before the 2010 election? No.
Okay.
And that's why they ran out of money.
Jeremy Hunt, lovely to see you this morning. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Camilla.
Well, coming up next, I'm going to be joined by the former Chancellor, Lord Norman Lamont, for his reaction to my interview with his successor, Jeremy Hunt. Don't forget, by the way, you can also sign up to join Dubes & Co and Farage's audiences next Wednesday in Whitehaven for their special Budget Day coverage. To secure your tickets, go to gbnews.com or sign up via the QR code displayed throughout today's show.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Dubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Yeah, so describe the contents of the letter for us, because it is quite strongly worded, isn't it? And it suggests that your property is empty. And what do they suggest it's going to be used for?
They say, as part of this process, Northamptonshire Council is identifying empty properties and sites within the area, with the aim of encouraging owners to bring premises back into use or to find alternative options for derelict sites. The resettlement team in North Northamptonshire Council supports asylum seekers and refugees across 3 different projects: Homes for Ukraine, Afghan resettlement and asylum dispersal. At present, we are seeing a considerable increase in positive immigration decisions being made in favour of asylum seekers. So basically, they're wanting accommodation. But who goes around and assesses whether these properties are lived in or they are actually empty?
Clearly, Ted, no one had bothered to come and look at your house at all, had they?
What do you want now? Because clearly you are both very shaken by this letter, and that letter that you've received in response has not gone far enough. Do you want an apology? What more do you want to see?
Well, she said here that she's, you know, I sincerely apologise, this Lindsay Bellchambers, but I don't see, there was no explanation as to how they've come to say this property was empty, whether it was disused, whether it was unkempt, or what. If you go back through the history of the property, it's not been empty.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Lord Norman Lamont joins me in the studio now. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1990 until 1993. Lovely to see you this morning. I put a question there to Jeremy Hunt. I know you just watched the interview about the OBR. Can you clear this up for us? Because on one hand, we can understand why the OBR was set up under Gordon Brown. It was to ensure that Chancellor's budgets had checks and balances. But now it seems as if the OBR is informing what should go in the budget. Is that right?
No, I don't think so. I think what the OBR is providing is information about whether what the government is planning to do in the future is consistent with responsibility and with the fiscal rules that the government itself has set down. It's not compelling, but it would be possible for the OBR to say something and the government to ignore it.
But then again, we had Jeremy Hunt there admitting that the OBR does make mistakes. Historically, it's got a lot of its predictions wrong. And yet we're obviously saddled as taxpayers with the consequence of those bad predictions.
Well, forgive my cynicism, but I think most forecasts have to be treated with a degree of scepticism. There's nothing guaranteed about any forecast, but I think it is important to have some discipline and to have some rules. It's far better than politicians simply deciding we can spend this amount of money without anybody saying, can you afford this?
What did you make of the Chancellor's interview with me there? He was being very cautious. He was talking about prudence. I said that I felt that he was lowering expectations around an income tax cut. What was your impression?
Well, I think the Chancellor is in a very nearly impossible position. It's the last fiscal event, the last budget before an election. The demands and the pressure to do something that will transform the climate, which is actually impossible. The budget can't transform the climate just like that. He's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's not a conjurer.
No.
He can't just suddenly deliver a completely changed environment. And the most important thing, he's got to think about what is in the interests of the country. That is the number one priority. So it's got to be responsible. It's got to be affordable. But at the same time, he wants to do something that will create the framework in which growth is at least possible.
Yes, but what about it being attractive to the electorate? I mean, you've got the Conservatives 20 points behind, got people taxed at the highest rate since the Second World War. We've heard MPs come in and out of this studio saying we've got to have something to sell on the doorstep. And if he doesn't cut taxes, what will they sell on the doorstep?
Well, that's just what I'm saying to you, that this is a very difficult, impossible position, because you won't be able to satisfy all the demands and all the expectations. And I think you're quite right. He was trying in his interview to get people to be realistic. You know, part of being a Conservative is about facing reality and being responsible.
Even if it costs you an election.
Well, you've got to put the national interest first and doing the right thing.
Do you think Conservatives get thanked for that, though?
Well, whether you get thanked or not, you've got to do it.
I mean, he said in an interview, I think, with the Sunday Telegraph this morning, you know, that they didn't get thanked enough for what they'd done on national insurance. And indeed, perhaps they don't get the credit they deserve for the money that they gave in furlough. That seems to have come back to haunt them. So is it the case that the Tories just don't get thanked for giving people free money?
Well, I don't think politicians should be looking for gratitude.
Yes.
I think that's the wrong thing to look for. But, you know, just taking this question, which I know you're very concerned about, the tax burden, and the tax burden being the highest for 70 years. What Jeremy said about the successive crises the government have had to deal with, but particularly COVID. When you think about COVID, and he said the government spent £500 billion, that is 15% of GDP. Now, if spending goes up by 15% of GDP, it's hardly surprising that the tax burden has gone up by a few percentage points.
Yes.
To cope with it. We've been through an event that in its financial impact is almost like that of a war.
Do you think the government spent too much money during COVID?
Well, I think possibly the government did spend too much money during COVID, but you didn't hear anybody saying that at the time.
But then what do you think's been more damaging for the economy? COVID or Brexit? That's the big debate that often takes place at the dinner table.
Well, I don't think Brexit's had any damaging effect on the economy, would be my own.
Tell that to the Europhiles. Why do you say that?
Well, I may say it to the... Well, if you just look at our trade statistics and our trade statistics with Europe, they're back on trend where they were before. I don't dispute that some small businesses find a lot of the form-filling rather onerous. Large businesses, I think, like Nissan said the other day, they have had, to their surprise, found actually they were coping perfectly well. I don't think it's had any harmful effect.
We have a People's panel on. It's in Birmingham at the moment. We've got two chaps on the panel who are businessmen, and they're saying about the lack of relief for people running SMEs. Do you sympathise with that? We've had 6% shaved off already fragile profit margins with this rise in corporation tax. We've talked a lot about individual income tax and household tax. What about business taxes? Do they need to come down?
Well, I think perhaps they ought to look at things like the VAT threshold for small businesses.
Raising that above 85 grand.
Yes, I think that's not that expensive, as I remember. I think that's something that maybe they ought to think about. It's this all form-filling and bureaucracy that small businesses find so difficult.
And as a former Chancellor, what's the one piece of advice you would give to Jeremy Hunt before Wednesday? I'd imagine it's quite nerve-wracking to prepare and deliver a budget.
Well, I would say stick to your own convictions, do what you think is right. That's the most important thing. Of course, you've got to give some indication about the future. He may not be able to do everything people want with taxes now, but indicate what he hopes to do in the future as well.
And does he need to pull out that magical rabbit from the hat?
I don't think he can produce a rabbit out of the hat. As I say, he's not a conjurer.
No, indeed. Or, indeed, can he grow magic money trees? Which is unfortunate, Lord Lamont.
Exactly.
Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Lovely to speak to you and to get your perspective on our interview with the Chancellor, which, don't forget, if you've missed, you can catch up on the GB News website. Now, coming up next, I'm going to be talking to Jason Miller, who used to be Donald Trump's right-hand man, to find out what he makes of the Donald's presidential hopes. Don't go anywhere.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
We're always told that there is a huge need for care workers in Britain. We're always told that the salaries just aren't big enough against the benefit system for British people to want to do that work. And there probably is some real truth in that. And yet, if up to 25% of those that come are acting illegally, and it would seem, up until now, that in some areas, foreign care workers come in, but bring in almost the same number of family members with them, that we need to have a proper debate about this. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mike Padgham, chair of the Independent Care Group. If I accept those arguments for a moment, how can it be that the system is so lax that up to 25% are found by the Inspector of Borders and Immigration to be working illegally?
Well, good evening to you, Nigel. It was good to join you. I mean, those figures are shocking to me. When I looked at it today, when I saw that 275 visas had been issued to a care home that didn't even exist, and a further over 1,000 people joined a company that only had previously 4 staff in it, it makes me wonder the bureaucracy of the Home Office didn't think to check that these companies exist in the first place, because it should be quite straightforward. If people are providing care, they're regulated by the Care Quality Commission. It's a simple phone call to check and double check. Sadly, there seems to have been very many loopholes at the beginning. I believe that's been tightened now, but I can't understand it, because all the providers that are doing it in the proper way have to go through quite a rigmarole to actually get approved, and it takes months. So it beggars belief that this has happened and people have been approved for a company that doesn't even exist.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Now, Trump's right-hand man is going to be joining me very shortly to discuss the Donald's chances of making America great again this year. But let's first of all hear from the People's Panel. They're in Birmingham. Jack Carson's with them. What's the chatter there in bright old Brum?
Well, some very interesting reactions to what some of course, your guests have been saying on the show, Camilla. We're joined with Sabrina Dennis, Steve Hardiman and Andrew Goodacre on the panel this morning. Sabrina, we're going to come to you first. We had Bridget Phillipson on, Shadow Education Secretary. Of course, you're concerned a lot just because of the work you do with young people. What do you make of some of her answers today, particularly around education and supporting young people?
Well, she gave us breakfast clubs, which is wonderful. But breakfast clubs aren't going to be sufficient. You know, if schools are falling down and they need repair, and there's no talk of that. There was no talk of supporting young people to find jobs. We've got the highest youth unemployment in Birmingham right now. There was no talk of anything to do with that. So, you know, if breakfast clubs are going to reduce youth violence, if breakfast clubs are going to help young people's mental health resilience, if they're going to connect them to opportunities, then that's great. But I don't really know what a breakfast club's going to do, to be honest.
And also from Jeremy Hunt, we talked about violence reduction units, and you mentioned knife crime as well. That's something you work particularly closely with.
Interesting, because he mentions violence reduction units. We have a partnership here in Birmingham, and it is great, but it is flash in the pan funding. What happens is they come along, they give funding for 2-3 years, and then all of a sudden that step down and that funding is redirected to somewhere else. If we're going to do these things, there needs to be a long-term investment plan in young people beyond the age of 5 years old, but all the way up to the age of 19 to 25 too, because young people need support, and that means long-term funding, not just a violence reduction partnership for knife crime today and then it's gone tomorrow. Communities are sick and tired of that. They need something that's sustainable and long-term.
All right, thank you very much, Sabrina. And Steve, what did you make of Jeremy Hunt's comments around the budget? Are you filled with any more confidence?
Same old, I'm afraid. I'm just fed up as a businessman and basically as a general punter. I've been taken for mugs. You know, a lot of what he said isn't going to happen. We need help, particularly as far as SMEs are concerned. There's nothing that he said that's going to improve matters. He may reduce the tax on certain things, but I think basically there's nothing for us.
So, Andrew, we're not going to be able to have time to come to you, and unfortunately, today for reaction to, of course, Jeremy Hunt. But as you heard there, not the happiest reactions, of course, to your guests today, Camilla.
A glum-looking People's panel in Birmingham. Thank you very much to Jack for that. Now, joining me is former Defence Secretary and, of course, my fellow GB News presenter, Michael Portillo. Michael, we're strapped for time, so give me a very quick run-through of what you've got coming up today at 11.
Good morning, Camilla. We're going to be looking at elections in Iran. We're going to be talking to American Republicans about why they're blocking funding to Ukraine. We're going to be celebrating Ray's incredible evening. She won 6 awards at the Brits last night. And we're going to be celebrating also 100 years of surrealism. So look out for melting clocks and disembodied eyeballs.
Surrealism, it's always a good thing to be talking about on GB News. And indeed, can I congratulate you on that fantastic jacket and tie combo, Michael, looking hot to trot as ever. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to be speaking to Donald Trump's former chief spokesman, Jason Miller. But first, here's a weather update.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, good morning. I'm Greg Dewhurst. Welcome to your latest GB News weather. It's quite chilly out there this morning. Some dense fog patches around too, some icy surfaces after temperatures below freezing across many parts. The fog will slowly lift and break this morning, and then there'll be a dry day for many. Plenty of sunny spells, brighter than Saturday, though this weather front will bring some cloud and outbreaks of rain along the east coast at times, so do be aware of this. Further west as well, a few showers will develop by the afternoon, but for many it will be dry, some bright spells, and temperatures, well, just a little higher than Saturday, 7 to 9 Celsius, and with a bit more sunshine around, it will just feel a little warmer too. Into the evening time, many showers start to fade away or become more confined to coastal areas, and then clear skies for many, though this frontal system will continue to affect the far northeast of Scotland. Under clear skies and light winds, we'll see some mist and fog patches developing as temperatures fall close to, if not below freezing, but temperatures rising towards the end of the night towards the very far southwest as the next weather system moves in, bringing cloud and outbreaks of rain through Monday morning across the southwest of the UK. Elsewhere, a cold, frosty start, but then plenty of sunshine to come through the day, though this turning increasingly hazy as we move through into the afternoon. Best of the sunshine holding on across Scotland, though the Northern Isles seeing further spells of rain, mild air and brisk winds coming into the southwest.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, Jason Miller, bless him, has been waiting very patiently. It's very early in Washington, D.C. We're very grateful to have him on the show. He's the former chief spokesman and senior advisor to Donald Trump. However, I understand, Jason, you're now back advising the Donald. Tell us, what's it been like working with him in recent times?
Well, I'm back for a third campaign. You can't go through the first two in 2016 and 2020 and then not come back for 2024. So excited to be back in a senior advisor capacity, and things are looking pretty good in the polls. So it looks like I made a good choice.
All right, so tell us, break it down for us. Obviously, we've seen everything that's been going on. Is it going to be a Trump versus Biden?
Absolutely. And so what we have here in the U.S. is it starts off at a state-by-state basis in the primary process, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina. But then coming up on Tuesday, we have Super Tuesday, where you have 15 states that will all be going at the same time. And so at the end of Tuesday, President Trump should be at about 1,100 delegates. His chief rival should be at about 90 delegates, less than 100. And you only need 1215 to get the majority and clinch the nomination. So he's right on the cusp, and then the general election starts.
OK, but what about all of these court cases? Is there a chance that President Trump could be imprisoned by the time that he starts to really start campaigning?
I have no concern, and there's no chance that anything happening on the legal front will impede President Trump's return to the White House. In fact, what you see with a lot of the surveys and the polling work that's been done is that a plurality, if not a majority, of Americans think that politics has a lot to play with these court cases. And as President Trump's lead over Joe Biden continues to grow, new New York Times numbers have him leading 48 to 43. most Americans realize, okay, the piling on here that's happening, this is just politics.
But you're comfortable, are you, back working with Donald Trump after the January 6th riots, after the fact that he claimed that he had actually won the election that he actually lost? I mean, I remember talking to you about this for The Telegraph, and you were quite uncomfortable with his stance at that point. How have you managed to put that aside to now be back working for him?
Well, very simply, what we saw in 2020 is many of the rules were changed during the game. And just in 2016, we saw different efforts to try to stop President Trump. 2020, of course, we saw the social media censorship. There was the massive scandal over the Hunter Biden laptop that was covered up when it came up, and the New York Post story and others were censored. And so now as we look to 2024, really the legal challenges, the legal attacks have replaced those. But when it comes down to it, most Americans are looking and saying the country's going in the wrong direction. About 3/4 of the country think it's going in the wrong direction. And so Americans believe almost universally that they were better off with President Trump, and that's why he's doing so well.
OK, but Jason, you don't agree with him that he actually won the last election instead of losing it, do you?
Well, what I've said over and over is that I thought the 2020 election was legally rigged. And what I mean by that is that they've gone in, they changed the rules in an unconstitutional manner. They didn't go through the state legislatures. And so, again, they changed the rules in the middle of the game. So I'm not at all happy with how 2020 turned out. But I do think 2024 will be completely different. I think it will be a landslide victory.
Really? OK, and what about the Capitol riots? How have you squared that circle? Because you can't have been happy about what happened on January the 6th.
Well, if Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, had taken the extra troops and National Guardsmen that President Trump had offered, then I don't think that that would have happened. But unfortunately, it was a day that was not very good for our country, but I don't see something like that happening in the future.
Do you have a sympathy with the American public sort of facing a bit of a Hobson's choice? It's a man who could be facing a custodial sentence versus a man who can't seem to finish a sentence.
Well, when you look at Joe Biden, especially as we saw the contrast this week of both Joe Biden and President Trump at the border, President Biden does not look that good these days. And I think ever since the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, all of our foreign adversaries have been licking their chops, whether it's Putin, whether it's Xi. We see chaos in the Middle East and Iran feeling emboldened once again. And so Americans want to have that sense of deterrence return, not just for our country, but for the world stage. And they want a strong leader. Right now, inflation is just crushing the average American. They want a strong leader back who can return some actual sense of fiscal sensibility. OK, but how will a President Trump ×2 handle Vladimir Putin? I mean, we heard what he said about those who weren't fulfilling their NATO spending pledges on defence. He was saying that basically they deserved to be invaded by the Russian president. It's not the best approach to geopolitics, is it? Well, we need to go and split out a couple of things here. First of all, keep in mind, Putin invaded Ukraine during Obama and Biden, and now Putin has invaded Ukraine during Biden. During those 4 years of President Trump, we had peace, we had prosperity, not just with regard to Ukraine, but also with regard to the Middle East. But now everybody sees weakness with Joe Biden. Now, to the second point that you're bringing up regarding NATO funding and defending our allies, it's very critical that our allies meet the NATO threshold for defense spending as a percentage of their GDP. When President Trump first came into office, we only had about, I believe it was about 3 who were actually meeting the requirement, finished up at about 10 or 11. Now, more recently, additional countries have started to meet that 2% GDP threshold, but we need more. You have 31 countries in NATO. Everybody should be meeting their 2% GDP level.
But people who suggest that Trump returning to the Oval Office will mean that President Zelensky is out of Ukraine, what's the response to that? I mean, we understand that the Trump administration and indeed Putin have had a different relationship to, say, Biden and indeed Obama. I mean, that's a fact, right?
Well, I think one of the things is many folks are looking at this in the wrong perspective about how do you go and win a war? Who wins the war? Who loses war? But President Trump takes a look and says, how do we stop the killing? How do we get this conflict to stop? How do we make sure that we don't have more deaths? And but you look at Ukraine. Ukraine has lost an entire generation with the deaths that have happened. All around Ukraine, cities are in rubble. But nobody is talking about how you stop the killing. And that's the problem right now is President Trump will get Putin and Zelensky together, and he will say this has to stop. He has pressure points for both of them. nobody else, Camilla, is actually talking about how you stop the killing.
OK, briefly as well, Jason, how's Melania? Is she on the scene? Are we going to see her holding her husband's hand as he goes and hits the campaign trail?
Well, Mrs. Trump is very supportive of the president running for the White House once again. I think we'll see her more as we go into the general election. She's a very private person. Of course, their son, Barron, is a senior in high school, so he'll be going off to university in the fall. But I think we'll see more and more of the First Lady.
All right, Jason Miller, I'm really grateful to you because I know you've got up very early to speak to us on GB News. So thank you very much and good luck with the campaign.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you to Jason and all of my guests today. I'm going to be back at 9:30 next Sunday. Michael Portillo is up next. And don't forget, if you missed any of my show today, you can catch up on the highlights at 6 p.m. here on GB News. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
...2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Is a debate on gender really a far-right issue?